This is chapter 15. I have no idea. Yep, I tried to figure this out from earlier. Even since, by the way. Yep. If I was gonna do this. Of course, I figured this before. I know, it's supposed to happen, right? Negatively, of course. I figured this out for a while. If I can see him, I guess it's still true. Yep. Spoons for a while. Wham! Me. Whole opposite. So, so you didn't know this? No, not yet. Okay, so you didn't know this? No, not yet. Okay, so, you're a creeper? Yep, I figured it out from earlier. Of course. If I can assume, you're a creeper for Minecraft? Yep. Okay, I was gonna know this if I can assume. Right, of course. I knew this was supposed to happen from earlier if I was gonna do this. Of course. I know, I figured stuff from earlier. Okay, I guess that's still true. Alright then, whew. We have no idea what I'm gonna do. Eventually, if I can assume, I guess that's still true. Yep. Until we have figured this out. I know, eventually. It's still kinda cool. If I can assume. Right? Okay, I was gonna notice that. I know, it's supposed to happen. Of course. If I can assume, visually. Hey, it's kinda obvious, isn't? Or, I don't know about that. Of course. It's supposed to happen from earlier. Yep, if I can assume. Alright, of course. You have no idea. I know, eventually. It was supposed to happen from earlier. Of course. You have no idea, eventually. I know, definitely. If I can assume. I guess that's still true from earlier. Yeah, yep. I agree from now on. Even since, by the way. How do we know this? We don't know yet. Right. Of course. I figured this out before. If I was getting into this. Alright, of course. You have no idea. Eventually, if I can assume. Yep. If I can assume, by the way. If I can assume. Can't let that happen for Burger. Well, it was still calling off for some reasons. Not yet, fully. Of course. I know, for some reasons, or might be. Right, of course. You know what? It might be. Right, did I get some bad ideas, or... we don't know yet. Right, of course. I know, it's supposed to happen from earlier, by the way. Of course. You have no idea. I know, it's supposed to happen from earlier. Right, of course. I know, eventually. You have no idea. I know, I was getting some ideas. Right, of course. If I can assume, I guess that's supposed to happen. Yep, I guess that's still true. Until I figured this out. It was still kinda obvious, isn't? Not yet, fully. Of course, I was gonna know this. Until that's supposed to happen. Also, I can't figure this out. If I can assume that's supposed to happen. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know, eventually. I can assume it's a little bit familiar, even since, by the way. Opposite, I have no idea. Of course. If I can assume, visually. I know. It's still kinda cool, visually. Well, if you can assume. Opposite. No. Opposite. Oh, yep. I have them over here. What? No. Can't think correctly. Whole opposite. Ugh. Hmm. It's a little bit familiar. That's all we got. Whoa! Hey, that spoon's about that. Yep. Okay, I guess that's still true, Vigily. If I can see him, I guess that's still true. I did not. Oh, upset. I did not spoon about this. Yep. If I could assume, kill the happy familiar. Of course. I was gonna know this. Yep. Okay. I did not spoon about that. Yep. If I could assume, I guess that's still true. Okay. I did not spoon about that. I guess that's kind of obvious. Yep. Okay, I guess that's still true. Yep. I have no idea what I'm gonna do. Yep, until I figured it out. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know. It was supposed to happen familiar. Even since, by the way. Right, of course. I know. It was supposed to happen familiar. Even since, by the way. I guess that's still true. Yep. If you assume. Right, of course. I guess that's still true before we know this. Yep. And how do we know this? We don't know yet. Right, of course. If I can assume, that might happen familiar, by the way. Okay. Know what to do. Meow? Meow, meow, meow. Meow, meow. Meow, meow. Meow? Meow? You have no idea. Meow, meow. Of course. It's okay. It's a little bit familiar. If I can assume. Meow, 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 meow. Okay. Alright then. That's good from now on. If I can assume. We can't let that happen familiar. It's still kind of obvious if they have to. Yep. I guess that's still true, Vigily. Not yet, the flea. If I can assume, by the way, I guess that's still true. So how are you gonna do this? We don't know yet, Vigily. I figured this out this familiar. If I can assume, it gets that's still true. Yeah. Of course. Okay. I guess I was gonna know this before we know this, Vigily. Of course. You have no idea it was supposed to happen familiar. If I can see him, Vigily. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know. It was supposed to happen familiar. Even since, by the way. Until we, figured out what to do about them. Right, of course. Until we figured this out. Right. And how do you know this? We didn't know yet. We figured out this before, even since, by the way. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know, it was supposed to happen familiar. If I can assume. I guess that's still true. Yep. If I was good to know this. Right, of course. I figured out for this for a while. But if I can assume, I guess that's still true. If you was good to know this. Yeah. Of course. If I was gonna know this. Okay, I guess that leaves the trail. Yeah? I know, it's supposed to happen. Definitely. If I could see him, I guess that's still true from earlier. I guess I was right for a bit. Yep. If you can see him, okay. Phew. Meow. Yeah, of course. I have no idea what I'm gonna do, Vigily. If I can see him, I guess that's still true. Before we know this, it just happens from earlier, by the way. If I can see him. Right, of course. I know, it was supposed to happen from earlier. If I could see him, it was still kind of obvious. Isn't or isn't? We don't know about that. Right, of course. Eventually, I guess that's still true. Yep. Until we figure it out, Vigily. Until we get some bad ideas. Right, of course. Yeah? I know, it's supposed to happen from earlier, by the way. Meow. Of course. We figured this out for a while. Before we know this, Vigily. Not yet, definitely. I spoons for a while. If I was gonna know this, I guess that's still true. Yep. And how do you know this? I don't know yet. Of course. You have no idea it's supposed to happen. Not yet, definitely. Spoons for a while. If I was gonna know this. Right, of course. I know, eventually. It was supposed to happen. And for Murrier, I guess that's still true. Yep. And how did you know this? We know, yeah. Right, of course. I guess that's still true. Yeah? I know. It's supposed to happen from earlier, by the way. I guess it's still quite obvious if they have to. I know, eventually. It was supposed to happen from earlier. I guess that's still true before we know this. I know, eventually. It was supposed to happen from earlier, by the way. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know. It was supposed to happen from earlier. Right, of course. If you could see him? Yep. I figured out that from earlier, by the way. If I could see him. Right. Of course, you have no idea. Yeah? I know, it's supposed to happen. Right, of course. You have no idea this is not supposed to happen. Yeah, if I could see him, by the way. I guess that's still true. Yep, if you can see him. Right, of course. I know, it's supposed to happen from earlier, by the way. I guess that's still kind of obvious, if they have to. Yep. Okay. I guess that's still true, eventually. If I can see him, I guess I can get all that happen. Yep. Okay. I guess that's still true. Yeah. I know, eventually. If I can see him, I guess that's still true. Before we know this. Yep. I can assume that's still true, eventually. If I can see him, it happens from earlier, by the way. Right, of course. Okay, I figured out this before, so that's okay from now on. Yeah, of course. If I could see him. Yep. If I was gonna know this, of course. I agree. Yep. If I was getting some ideas, of course. I know. Eventually, yep. If you consume, of course. Agree. Yeah. You have no idea it was supposed to happen, right? If I assume, I guess that's still true, Vigily. If I assume, yeah.